This is my review for Quake for the Nintendo Switch. It's an exceptional value at $9.99 in the Switch eShop at full price. I do have a physical cartridge on the way coming from Limited Run Games, and the physical cartridge is actually going to have both Quake and Quake 64 on the cartridge without any download. When you download Quake from the eShop for $9.99, you get the basic Quake game, which has been remastered for widescreen. It runs very, very smooth. It's very beautiful, but it's still got that pixel art feel to it. It runs very beautifully, and then you can go into the add-ons menu and enable a Quake 64, which will download a 64-bit texture pack, which has kind of a CRT filter on it, so it plays and feels more like the Quake 64. It's the exact same game. The only difference is the graphics, and it's running on the 64-bit engine, the Quake 64 engine. You could download that from within the game itself. You don't need anything special. It's not an extra DLC cost or anything. So it's a pretty good value for $10. You're getting Quake and Quake 64. You can play the flavor that you like best. There's a lot of gameplay to Quake. There's also multiplayer options. There's a whole bunch of good stuff in there. For a game from the 90s, but it plays very smooth, and so if you grew up in the 90s and you played Quake, it's definitely worth the $10. Graphics-wise, like I said, basic pixel art, same textures you remember. They did upgrade the graphics for modern consoles, so there's a lot of like ambient occlusion, there's lens, there's like muzzle flash flare that reflects on the walls, it's almost ray tracing. There is ray tracing for it on PC, but obviously on Switch it doesn't happen, but you still get the dynamic lighting and the dynamic shadows that you get from modern consoles. So I feel like the graphics upgrades give it a bump, but at the end of the day, it's still a 90s game with 90s texture packs. So I've got to give it kind of a low score, but I'm going to give it extra points for having the CRT mode for the Quake 64 and the upgrades to dynamic lighting and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and give the graphics there a 6.5. Gameplay-wise, plays exactly the way I remember. Now, I never played Quake on a controller. I always played with mouse and keyboard, even from day one on PC. So I never played Quake 64 for the Nintendo 64 because I really didn't see the value in it when I had Quake for PC. But I gotta tell you that the gameplay was pretty good. The button controls are good. There's the D-pad is up is shotguns, right is your different. You press it multiple times to cycle the different shotguns. You press to the right to cycle the different nail guns. You press down to cycle the different rocket launcher, grenade launcher, and you push to the left to go to the axe mode for the melee. So they did a good job of integrating the controls for that. So you have your standard shoot button is your right trigger, and then you have a jump button. I feel like they did a pretty good job with gameplay. I really enjoy it. I enjoy Quake a lot. It's a great first-person shooter. It's a great kind of spiritual successor to Doom, made by the same people. So I'm going to go ahead and give gameplay a 7.5. I would give it a 7, but it's got that nostalgic factor that give it that extra half a point. Audio-wise, you don't get a whole lot better than the ambient soundtrack for Quake. Maybe Doom 2016 obviously takes the cake, 10 out of 10, but when you're talking about 90s games and soundtracks, they hired Nine Inch Nails. They hired Trent Reznor to make the soundtrack, and they were expecting a Nine Inch Nails album, but for instrumental, but for Quake. And what they got was this ambient, creepy, industrial sound. And at first they didn't like it. They were like, no, do over. And he was like, no, this is it, I promise. And it paid off, and it works. I love the sounds. I love the music. The boss sounds could be a little better, like the enemies. They kind of have that generic sound. Each one makes one or two sounds, and that's basically all they make. They don't have a lot of depth. But they're trying to keep it, traditional. They're trying to keep it in its same vein. But you got to appreciate the Quake soundtrack. So I'm going to give it a 7 because the soundtrack is just that good. Story-wise, Quake and Doom and those generations of games, they've really they needed more story. There is lore to be had for Quake and for Doom. and you love it. But as the way the story evolves in Quake is you got to get these runes, and every rune you get is a rune of power to destroy the evil, blah, 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 blah. It's pretty standard. I'm going to go ahead and give the story a 6 because I feel like that's pretty... it's not terrible. It's not the worst storyline, and there aren't a bunch of plot holes in it, but it just doesn't... It doesn't really, keep you guessing as to what's about to happen. So overall, that brings this to a 6.75. I'm going to round it up to a 7 if I have to use whole numbers for something like Metacritic. But a 7 isn't bad. It's kind of my average review. I like giving games a 7. I rarely give games below a 5 unless they're just terrible.